We are in a series called The Biblical Worldview. We're trying to look at what does the Bible say about some of the big issues that are in our nation. And today's message is part 4 of that series. But if you missed part 2 or part 3 last week or the week before, then you've I'm assuming in this message that you're with me from the last couple weeks. Every government is built on a theology, whether you call it a philosophy of human nature. What is human nature? How much government? What kind of government do we need? And we talked about what the Bible says about human nature 2 weeks ago. So if you did not hear that in today's message, you're thinking, Seth, where are you coming from? Please listen to the message 2 weeks ago. Last week, we looked at what does the Bible say about government in general. That was the first half of the message. And the second half of the message was, what does the Bible, or how does that compare to our particular system of government in comparison? And how should we think about government? And particularly as we're coming up on election, how do you take the biblical principles of government and apply them in our context? Now, the second half of that message would not have applied to Christians in Indonesia or China or Iran, but for those of us who live in America, I hope that helped to make some sense. Today we're looking at sort of the next step out of that is what are some of the current systems of government that are being proposed over the last 10 or 20 or longer years in our particular culture, and how are we to think about them? And I'd like to do 3 of these today. Globalism, political socialism, not economic socialism. I'm going to talk about that when we get to our message on economics and work. But political socialism and secularism are our 3 for today. Now, globalism is one of those terms that gets thrown around, and it means different things to different people. For example, if you talk to a businessman about globalism, the first thing that comes to their mind is more markets to sell my goods. I'm not talking about that kind of globalism. If you talk to, in our country, a few years ago, workers in manufacturing, and you give them the word globalism, the thing that comes to their mind is my job got shipped overseas. I'm not talking about that kind of globalism. If you talk to just general folks like you and me about globalism, maybe what we think is, wow, we can talk to anybody around the world virtually and travel almost anywhere pretty quickly. I am not talking about that kind of globalism. This kind of globalism has to do with more in the realm of political science. You say, well, what does globalism have to do with us today? Well, the question of globalism relates to some of the hot topics that have been debated in our country, like, should a country have borders? Is that a good thing? There are some in the globalist camp that say that is a bad thing. In fact, it's an evil thing. Should you have a citizenship? For centuries, nations have citizenship. With globalism, citizenship is seen as a bad thing. Anybody should be able to be a citizen. What about immigration? Is it okay to have legal immigration? Over here, immigration is generally seen as bad in the globalist, whether it's legal or illegal. And then probably this gets the fury up more of a lot of people that are globalists is what about ICE, our border security? And you hear about people that want to abolish ICE and defund ICE, etc. So that's sort of one of the strains going on in our country is this push to globalism. Secondly is the push to socialism. Now this has been around a long time in world history. Generally speaking, in our nation, it's my opinion and my opinion only, that generally what's heard in high schools and universities about socialism is the marketing of socialism in all of its ideals and what it will accomplish and what great things can happen. We can overcome poverty and racism and ethnicity, and everybody can have everything that they need. Now, certainly, everybody would say, boy, wouldn't that be great if we lived in a world like that? Of course. But what generally I don't hear is the reality of what happens with socialism down the road. Eventually, what ends up happening here. And then secularism. And by secularism, I don't necessarily mean people who are atheists. You can be a theist, believe in God, and still be a secularist. The way I'm using the term is what really drives us more? Our relationship with God or what we think is best? Now, you can believe in God, but if what really drives you is what you think is best, then by my terminology today, I'm using that as secularist, even if you are a God-believing person. Secularism goes back into many different strains. Karl Marx is probably the most well-known here, the Communist Manifesto, and that's certainly, his writings have certainly inspired a lot of movement in this direction. But generally, secularism has at its core underpinnings the putting of political power in the hands of a few or one or an elite. And what that involves is the control of a nation or nations, if possible, in its pursuit of the great ideals that I mentioned just a minute ago. The big kahuna, in my opinion, and this goes right back to Karl Marx, is the overthrow of the Judeo-Christian morality and ethic. The eradication of that. And you see that all around the world, and you see the growing sense of this in our own country. So those three big streams. Now, there is a story in the Bible that I think relates to all this and gives us some insight into these that hopefully will help us understand this, and that is a very famous story in Genesis 11 called the Tower of Babel. And you ladies that are studying this, you'll be getting here pretty soon. Tower of Babel is a very interesting story. And what we're going to look at is what did those men do and why did they do what they did? It made sense to them to do the things they did. They expected some certain outcomes. So, Genesis 11:1. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. That's kind of hard to believe, isn't it? You know, for some of our folks who are missionaries overseas, what would it be like to go to a country where you didn't have to learn language? Verse 2. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Now, this is post-flood, post the big worldwide flood. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Now, so far you think, you know, there's nothing to see here. You know, people build cities and they build tall buildings and skyscrapers. But verse 4 tells us not just what they did, but why they did it. "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Now, in a nutshell, what's the what? They wanted to build a city, and they wanted to build a tower that reached to the heavens. That's the what. What is the why? That we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth. Now, this may sound rather innocuous to you and to me, and yet this goes in defiance of what God had been speaking to the people and what these people knew. This is Genesis 11:1. In Genesis 9:1, God communicates the same message that he told them that's recorded in Genesis 1:28. It's in your handout. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth." That's the important phrase there for our consideration. "And subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over every living creature that moves on the ground." Now, these men that were in the book of, in building the city and the tower, are we going to switch out my little guy here?
We are.
Okay. How's that? We good back there? Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Now, these fellows at the Tower of Babel were within the living range of Noah and his sons. They would have known about a worldwide flood. They may have still seen some of the devastation of a worldwide flood. They knew why the flood had happened because of human sin, and that they had violated and were violating God's commands. They knew all of that. And they said, instead of scattering out and filling the earth like we were told to do, we're not going to do it. We're going to stay right here. We're going to build a city, and we're going to build a tower. We're going to make a name for ourselves. We refuse to be scattered away from each other. Verse 3, how do we know that they knew all this? Verse 3 tells us, they said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Now, what does this tell us? They figured that they knew that they were sinning and breaking God's command. They also knew, number two, that last time this happened, a worldwide flood would come along. So they had a choice to make. Should we not do what we want to do, or should we go ahead? They decided we're going to go ahead and do what we want to, but this time we're going to be smart about it. We're going to build a city and a tower made out of bricks. Now, why is that important? Because back then they could make a much stronger building and a much taller building, more stability with bricks than they could at that time with undressed stones. And then it says, and they used brick instead of stone, tar for mortar. The tar would help cement the bricks together, but it was also provided waterproofing. God sent the flood this time. We are going to be ready. And then it's a tower that builds all the way up to the heavens. Now, I think there were two reasons for this. Number one was, no amount of flood, no matter how great the flood waters, is going to defeat us. And secondly, they wanted to build that high tower as a testament to them. Up to the heavens sort of insinuates about their own pride. Now, what do we learn from this story? What is undergirding the thinking of these men, and as it relates to our day today and down through world history? And there are four things that strike me in your handout, that they were secular driven. Now, again, if you had asked them, do you believe in God? Do you think God exists? They probably would have said yes. So what I mean by secular, again, in this context is, whether or not they believe God is immaterial. What really matters is, what do we think ought to be done? Secular driven. Number two, power driven. We know what to do. We want to be in charge. And in many of the different systems of government, what you find is the exaltation of power in the elites, or in a few, or one. Third, control driven. It appears to me that none of the people in that story had really a choice about scattering. They all thought, maybe we should stay here. And we have our first, as far as I can tell, government-sponsored projects, building projects, shovel-ready jobs. We're going to build a city and a tower that reaches to the heaven. The people implied here, to me, is that they had to comply, or they happily complied along the way. And finally, it was pride-driven. They wanted to make a name for themselves. Now, in world history, whenever you put a combination of any four of these drivers together, eventually it ends badly, no matter what the ideals are on the front end. Secular-driven, power-driven, control-driven, pride-driven. In essence, government gets larger and people become smaller. The bigger the government, the smaller the people. The bigger the government, the less freedom. We talked about this in the second half of the message last week. It doesn't matter in the final analysis what intentions you have on the front end. They have to fit with the reality of who people are, our nature, and how we tick. Now, it's at this point, halfway through the story, that God intervenes. Verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and tower that the men were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Now, in our American culture, we like the word synergy. and collaboration. And there's a good place for synergy and collaboration. It's a good idea. I need a new one of these fellas, huh?
Just left angle.
All right. Good collaboration. Thank you. But there's also such a thing as bad collaboration and bad synergy, illustrated in Proverbs chapter 1. Or if you note history, think about the power that the mafia has in some cities or some nations, or drug lords. When we were in Guatemala a number of years ago for a mission trip, the city bus drivers were being extorted for money so that people wouldn't blow up their bus. You know where that came from? Gangs in L.A. That's rather remarkable to think about. That's bad collaboration. Now, when I think about this, I think about a math equation, and this is in your handout. Also, we have this on the screen. Rebelling against God's design is the first thing. They knowingly did this. Number 2, knowingly scheming against God's commands. This is the building of the tower with bricks, the city, and the tar. Number 3, being driven by pride and ego. The goal is to control a lot of people. And if you add those things up, you end up with the eruption and deepening of evil. Now, you can find this in world history, wherever these particular drivers are in place. Eventually, this is where it ends up. On the less extreme end, it ends up with usually nations going through a financial crisis. On the deeper ends, it usually means people being murdered by their own government. Genesis 11:7. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. God looks at what's going on here and he goes, oh boy. Decisive action is needed. And the picture here of being able to communicate, imagine for us, if we were normally speaking English and suddenly this happened to us and we got done with worship, we tried to communicate and have coffee and not understand each other, it'd be chaos. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them over all the earth and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Now, in the big picture, there are two things that strike me from the verses we just read. God put a sudden stop to the building project of the city and the building project of the tower. Sudden stop. But secondly, he ended up getting them to do the very things that they were supposed to do in the first place. They ended up being scattered as they were supposed to do over the face of the earth. On the back side of your handout, there are several things that strike me about God's perfect justice. His perfect justice. What the leaders considered their strength, their unity, their collaboration together, God destroyed through the lack of communication, the inability to communicate. What was their greatest fear? Their greatest fear was being scattered. What did God do? He scattered them. That was the effect of this. What did they want most? To make a name for themselves. And in an ironic sort of way, they did, but not how they wanted. Because when you think about the word Babel, usually that word is associated with a little baby about the age of my first granddaughter. By the way, I now have 2 granddaughters. The other one's about, 3 weeks old or so? Cole and Liz. But my oldest is right at that point where she's just starting to learn to imitate, words. And what you hear is babble. We use that, babbling. That comes from this very word, this thing here. To make a name for themselves, they made a name for themselves, but it was a name of folly. Number 4, the building of the city and tower stopped. Number 5, they became a laughingstock. And what's illustrated in this story And what is seen time and time and time again over the course of thousands of years of world history, those who would centralize power fail miserably. It's only a matter of how they're going to fail and to what extent. Now, how does this affect us in 2020? Each of the three strains that we're looking at, globalism, political socialism, and secularism, have some common roots to them that we normally don't think about. And the different roots, each of these elements or movements has different types of these roots. Not all of them have all four, but there's some combination of. A secular-driven, we don't need the Judeo-Christian ethic. We don't need the Bible. We don't need Christianity. Second, power is usually down to an elite or an individual. The purpose is control of the society or the nation, and usually it's power-driven. Although, if you talk to the leaders who are in this movement, they will never say that they are power-driven. They will always point to their ideals, what they want to see happen. And the idea that you would accuse them of being power-hungry or proud or self-centered would just be abhorrent to them. They cannot see this. But ideals are never enough. Now, these movements all appeal to ideals. And there are things I mentioned at the beginning of this message that we would all love to see. The harmony of the races, the harmony of ethnics, and the nations getting along, and no more wars, and people having the goods and services and food they should all have. We all agree those things would be lovely to have. The question is, how? How can that happen? Now, no system of government is perfect because we're all sinners. But there are some that can deliver more than others. Now, all of these three that I mentioned, globalism, political socialism, secularism, appeal to ideals, as I mentioned. But what they fail to do is to also consider the second part of human nature, and that is our depravity. Our depravity. The things that mess this up, that screw it up, that where we search for this, we want this, but somehow in the execution of it, we make it less likely to happen. Our world history has countless examples of this. There are many countries that began as socialist or turned to socialism as the way to deliver on their ideals. And some of those over a long period of time end up with economic crisis, like countries like Italy, Greece, Spain, Brazil. Currently, Venezuela, where you get to stand in line for toilet paper in the hopes that there'll be some left. Or rummaging through the local city dump in hopes of foraging for food. Years ago, I remember talking to some people that were telling me that I was misguided about socialism, and they pointed to Venezuela as this is how socialism ought to be done. And in my mind, I remember thinking, clip and save. Over time, we'll see how that delivers. Sometimes socialism morphs into worse things than just economic crisis. Sometimes socialism morphs into communism. Sometimes it morphs into fascism. Let me read you a sentence from a speech in history. All the more so after the war, the German National Socialist State, which pursued this goal from the beginning, will tirelessly work for the realization of a program that will ultimately lead to a complete elimination of class differences. Who wouldn't want that? Speaker is talking about ideals and to the creation of a true socialist community. Who wouldn't want that? This speech was given on March 21st, 1943. At the commemoration of the Heroes Memorial Day in Berlin by Adolf Hitler. That's not to say that every socialist country ends up like Hitler. It is to illustrate the worst of what can happen when the underpinnings at the beginning are faulty. And the warning, not just of world history, but of the Tower of Babel, should awaken us to the underpinnings. This is why we took time last week to look at what does the Bible say about government. Now, thankfully, God did not destroy the people of Babel. He was merciful even in his judgment. Fast forward a couple millennia. God's people were had been taken off into captivity from the Assyrians. And that group of people never rose again. Just vanished into history. 150 years later, in the year 586 BC, the southern kingdom, Judah, was taken over by Babylon, and they were taken into captivity. Some of them, and some in the northern kingdom in 722 BC, tried to escape to Egypt, what was then known as Cush, modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. And even though the people had gone through a time of terrible judgment and being overrun by Babylon and Assyria and taken into captivity, that was not the end of the story. In Zephaniah 3:9, God says, "Then I will purify the lips of the people, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder." Now, the idea here, in contrast to our guys in Babel, what God sees is a time when the people will be theists. They will believe in God, but they will not be secularists. They will serve him shoulder to shoulder. That takes the priority over what I want to do. Verse 10, "From beyond the rivers of Cush," modern-day Sudan, Ethiopia, "my worshipers, my scattered people," this time scattered for the wrong reasons, from human point of view, "will bring me offerings. On that day you will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me." We sang about that this morning. This is the wonder of the gospel. You will not be put to shame for the wrongs you have done to me. That's one of the things that brought me to tears today as we were singing that song. "Because I will remove from this city those who rejoice in their pride." You hear the story of Babel in these verses? The warnings. These people did not heed the warnings. We have a chance to heed the warnings. "Never again will you be haughty on my holy hill." Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for this story. Like so many Bible stories, at first glance it seems so simple, and yet there's so much in this story for us to learn and to compare and contrast with the world that we live in. Would you help us to have eyes to see truth as truth is, the world, the reality of a fallen world that we do live in? This is the idea of trying to build a utopia is impossible on this earth, or a utopian ideal. These always end badly. Help us to turn to you as individuals, as a people, as your people, and a nation. Help us to ask the question, what is it you want us to do? And help us to be about that task. We thank you for the hint of the gospel in this story, that you will not take your people, allow your people to live in shame for what they have done. And we thank you so much for the wonder of the grace of Jesus.